right, our last speaker of the day is Alexander Burns. He is an assistant professor of history at Franciscan University of Steubenville. His research focuses on the Atlantic world, the American Continental Army, and military Europe. Alex received his PhD from West Virginia University. His dissertation focused on letter writing among common soldiers in the 18th century British and Prussian armies. His first major publication, how old are you? You look like you're 12. What do you mean your first major publication? Sorry about that. I always interject comments. Was The Changing Face of Old Regime Warfare. Was a Festschrift,
yep.
Okay, for Christopher Duffy. He runs,
Kabinetskriege, yeah,
okay,
yeah.
An 18th century digital humanities project. His next book project, Firm Battalions in American Fire, the Continental Army and Military Europe, explores European influence on the tactical practices of George Washington's Continental Army. Dr. Burns.
Thanks so much, Joan, and thank you all for being here. Steve, thank you so much for organizing this. And also to our generous sponsors. I especially love to see when the DAR and the SAR sponsor things. My ancestors were in the 64th and 71st Regiments of Foot, and I'm also related to Hessian Jäger Colonel von Wurm, and so I always think it's maybe a miracle that I don't burst into flames spontaneously when I'm here speaking to DAR or struck by lightning or something like this. But I'm here today to present on the enemy and hopefully give the enemy maybe a little bit more of a human face. Sometimes we think about the British and their military in the 18th century. They can appear robotic, and so I want to try and contextualize this unit that plays such an important role in the war in the West. It's kind of a blessing and a curse to go at the end of the day. I'm the only thing in between you all and dinner and mass, potentially, and then also the wonderful museum tonight. But it's also very nice to go at the end of the day because you are able to maybe make some connections that other speakers have brought up through their presentations throughout the entire day. So we've already heard a little bit from Dr. Owens and Dr. Turnbull about the nature of Indian diplomacy in the West during the American War of Independence, and that is very much as well a theme of my talk. And then also, of course, Steve just reminded us of the kind of British grand strategic goals in the war, particularly sort of the middle way through the war. But I really want to explore maybe a more personal story of a particular British unit. What did the war look like on the ground for them in the West? And this is the 8th Regiment of Foot. And so I want to start off by often what you hear about the 8th Regiment. There's a very frequently utilized quote from Ensign Thomas Hughes, who's in the 53rd Regiment. And he's writing this after the war is concluded in 1785, as the British Army is demobilizing and going back to Europe. And so he is taking on men in his regiment, the 53rd, drafts from the 8th Regiment of Foot. And he records in his diary, and you can see a version of it there. I photographed at the Patricia Klingenstein Library in New York City. The transports carried the 8th Regiment. They had been 17 years in the country, mostly in the upper posts, and were rather a regiment of invalids rather than soldiers. We were obliged to take some of drafts from them who were no great credit to us, being the worst-looking soldiers and drunkenest men that ever carried a musket. So not a ringing endorsement of the 8th Regiment of Foot. And on first glance, it might appear as though Ensign Hughes's comments sound very similar to what Dr. Nelson told us in the first panel, that it's really the third and fourth rate parts of these armies that are fighting out in the West. But I want to try and carefully examine this in the few minutes we have together here this evening and look at some of the ways that, yes, this unit was absolutely a garrison regiment most of the war for them. As I was talking with Craig Wilson, who's the chief curator at Michilimackinac before the panels today. For most of the war, these troops were cutting wood. They were shoveling sand at Michilimackinac. They weren't actually out on combat operations for a lot of the war. But that doesn't necessarily mean they weren't fulfilling a vital role, and we'll hopefully look at some of the ways they fulfill that vital role both in and out of combat today. So let's turn now and talk a little bit about the prehistory of the regiment. Why, maybe in some ways, this is not a third or fourth-rate unit, but is in many ways one of the best regiments in the British Army. You see here the 8th or King's Regiment. They're a royal regiment. That means they're allowed to wear blue facings, as opposed to the Indian Department Captain, what was it, Lieutenant Airhead, Steve? But you have blue facings as opposed to black to denote their royal status. The regiment is formed in 1685, all the way back in the 17th century, as the Princess Anne of Denmark Regiment. And Princess Anne will eventually go on to become Queen Anne during Queen Anne's War that we have in North America, in addition to being the War of Spanish Succession over in Europe. But in the 1680s, it's raised because of religious disputes within England. And so you have Monmouth's Rebellion in 1685. And this unit is raised to essentially fight a Protestant rebellion. This religious dissension continues in the early history of the regiment. One of the major controversies in 1688 is the regiment is ordered to take on drafts of Irish Catholics. And the Protestant officers in this regiment, particularly an officer named Lieutenant Colonel John Beaumont, is very opposed to taking on drafts of Irish Catholics. And so they lodge a formal letter of protest. The king gets involved. He sends some gendarmes essentially to go and arrest these officers. But it actually turns out in the regiment's favor because a few months later, the Glorious Revolution, or essentially like a Dutch Protestant coup, happens. And the old king is sent into exile. He becomes the head of the Jacobite movement. And then the new king favors this regiment. Lieutenant Colonel Beaumont is taken out of prison, and he's actually put in to be the colonel proprietor of this regiment. So very early on, just 3 years after its founding, you have a situation where the monarch is starting to associate with this regiment. And this continues. Eventually, Queen Anne stops being Princess Anne of Denmark. She starts being Queen Anne of Great Britain. And as a result, this unit, bearing her name, becomes the Queen's Regiment. And it continues that, and there's a lot of battles in the War of Spanish Succession I'm not going to get into. But again, in the internal politics of Britain, you have Jacobite rebels who are trying to restore that old Stuart dynasty to the throne of Britain. And so when the Hanoverian succession, all the Georges, we of course are fighting George III in the Revolutionary War, when they take over in 1714, you have a small war that happens in England, the 1715 uprising. There's fighting both in England, in the north of England and Scotland. And this regiment performs very well at the Battle of Sheriff Muir. And so the new king, George I, says, well, we're going to change the name of this regiment from being the Queen's Regiment to being the King's Regiment, because they fought so well to support my dynasty. And so again, there's this kind of tradition, royal connection that's very important. I'm not going to get into all of the various battles of the War of Austrian Succession, the 7 Years' War in Europe. These soldiers did fight maybe battles you've heard of, like Culloden, again protecting the dynasty, and also very effectively at fighting in the 7 Years' War at battles like Wilhelmsthal and Wellinghausen. So, how do we know what we know about the regiment? To a large degree, there are a number of archival holdings across the United States, across Canada, and Europe that inform us about the history of this unit, and you'll see photographs of documents that primarily come from these three sources that are up on the slide right now. That's me in 2018 with some of my friends from West Virginia University. We were all doing research over there at the National Archives of the United Kingdom, Kew. And so, for example, in this next slide, we have a photograph of the regimental returns, which tells us a little bit of the story of this regiment, of what these units are like in what we might call the social history of this unit. And there are a variety of returns in the 18th century that have been preserved, that historians can still examine today. These are the returns from 1768, just before the 8th or King's Regiment is sent to go fight in North America, or sent to go be deployed to North America. And so 7 years before the American War of Independence will break out, they're already being deployed to North America. By the time everything is done, they're not going to come home from this North American deployment for 17 years. And so we think of long deployments today in the U.S. military. It might be a year and a half. These folks are deployed in Canada, essentially, for 17 years. It's a very, very long deployment. Right before they go, you can see the average age, about 25. Average height, one of the most pernicious myths that I encounter with both my undergraduate students and the general public is that everyone in the 18th century was very, very short, and this is really not true at all, right? The average height you see here of a man is, in this unit, is 5 feet 8 inches, maybe a little bit smaller than our average height today. Very long-serving soldiers, 8 years of experience on average. So these are veteran troops, even when they're being deployed to North America in 1768. And you can also see the breakdown of their ethnicities, right? So you have both a large English contingent and smaller Scottish and Irish contingents in this unit. And as we'll see here in a minute, some other nationalities as well. The 8th is deployed to Canada, and they're getting ready to come back when the war breaks out. And as a result, their deployment is extended. And they are sent out in 1774 to the upper country posts. And as hostilities break out in 1775 and 1776, the regiment is expanded. It's expanded with additional drafts from other units, but also, as you can see here, 72 German soldiers, not the Hessians, quote unquote, that Dr. Baer was talking about earlier, but these are recruits from Germany at this time, the Holy Roman Empire, that are actually being sent to fight in the regular red-coated British military. And so there are 72 of these German soldiers that actually fight in the Midwest for the British. So Germans are everywhere in the American War of Independence, not just where there happen to be the auxiliaries that Dr. Baer discussed before. In addition, you can see the ways that the regiment is bulked out on this slide, right? 97 more British recruits. So at this point, we have maybe closer to 600 men in the regiment. So it's growing in size as the war is coming on. I want to pause the story of the regiment now that hostilities have broken out and talk a little bit about the way that the British Army fought the Revolution. And maybe this can help us understand how the 8th Regiment might be an effective military force in the upper country during the war. So this is, in many ways, I think, how my undergraduate students picture the British Army in the War of Independence. Of course, this is Howard Pyle's famous painting of the British attack on Bunker Hill. And in actuality, the British Army did not really look like this. They didn't fight the war in this way. They were a much more flexible and adaptable force that were capable of giving George Washington a run for his money, certainly, but also fighting effectively in the West. Likewise, we have visions, and these are some of David Wright's sort of portraiture here of the American frontiersmen, of the British are hopelessly outmoded. I mean, would you rather be a British soldier with a powdered wig and a bearskin cap, or would you rather be a long rifleman fighting against him? I think the choice is pretty clear on the surface. But it's important to realize the British, as a result of their experience in the French and Indian War, are actually quite adept at fighting in the upper country, and they're maybe a little bit more dangerous than their uniforms or our popular memory of what those uniforms looked like might first appear. And this is not all my research. Largely this comes from the phenomenal work of a British historian named Matthew H. Spring that came out in 2008. All of you should read this book. It's an amazing sort of look at the way the British actually fought the war. The British are able to fight flexibly and adaptably as a result of, and I know maybe Jim will correct me a little bit tomorrow, the lack of heavy cavalry in North America. And so they fight in open order. They frequently lie down when they're under fire. They hide behind trees. And this is the British Army that's fighting George Washington out on the East Coast, is adapting in all of these ways. And certainly the 8th Regiment of Foot is doing this as well in the upper country. So again, it's not exactly that British Army that maybe we had pictured from The Patriot or from other popular depictions. This is a very adaptable, flexible, and aggressive force. And the British goal is not to engage in sort of a long firefight with the Americans, where American skill with firearms may tell and cause attrition on the British Army. Their goal is to jog quickly into close range, perhaps 100 yards, fire a volley, and then attack the American force with bayonets. Again, they're not marching slowly like robots. They're moving at a trot. They're moving at a jog. They're trying to quickly use the momentum to end the battle, to push the American forces off the field where the Americans can be broken up and dispersed. And so as a result, and again, these aren't my ideas. These come from Dr. Spring's work. These are flexible but really aggressive tactics the British utilized in the American War. And the role of junior officers is even more important than it would otherwise be as a result of this flexibility. Junior officers don't just have to manage sort of a slowly moving battle line. They have to manage a flexible battle where they might need to maneuver their platoon independently of the rest of their regiment. And so this style of fighting is actually very good preparation for the type of thinking and independent decision-making that the officers in the 8th Regiment will have to do in the upper country in North America, because frequently it's maybe a captain or a lieutenant in command of an overall war party. Normally, an officer who is this junior would not be having to make independent decisions. But again, the war in North America is a little bit different. The British are not exactly the hidebound and traditionalist force that we're often led to assume. And so whether they're fighting at cowpens or in Brandywine or in the battles that we're going to discuss in the upper country, the British are very focused on intimidating the American force, trying to almost like posture with their bayonets, shout. American sources sometimes call this giving the Indian halloo. They recall the battle cries that these British soldiers are sort of giving vent to as being very intimidating. And this is a marked departure from the British Army in the 1740s and 1750s, the army of James Wolfe that demanded silence as soldiers were advancing. Here, again, the British are almost putting a lot of their eggs in the basket of trying to intimidate and frighten American forces. They're hoping maybe some of these lower quality American forces, these militia that we've been hearing about today, will not stand and fight. They'll break off the battlefield and withdraw. Again, I know you're seeing a lot of pictures of reenactors, but I just would like to say again, the British lie down, the British hide behind trees, the British are deployed in open order in this conflict, and it's actually one of the best sources we have for this in the war in Canada comes from one of those German soldiers that Dr. Beer was sort of examined in her monograph, and this is Adolf von Redesel. And so let's look at what he says at a fight near Three Rivers in Canada in the summer of 1776 as American forces are withdrawing from their first invasion of Canada during the war. So the brigadier, a British officer, went to meet them, the rebels, on the road to Montreal and came across their column. He halted and gave orders for one of the English regiments to lie down, and in this position send one well-placed volley after another at the enemy, whilst unseen themselves. This was all the more successful as it was in a dense forest where they had met the rebel column. The enemy took flight in the utmost confusion at this unexpected firing and hastened back to the water. And so I always, when I'm going over this with my undergraduates, I always say in this situation, it's the British who are Mel Gibson and the Americans who are being surprised, right? So this is maybe another way of thinking, it's not your father's British Army. It's a very different, British Army than we might initially expect. Riedesel continues explaining where this comes from. It comes from the history of the British Army, the French and Indian War. But the English, make it one of their chief rules and principles in this country that no maneuvers may ever be carried out in serried ranks in these districts that are so terribly wooded. Serried ranks is where the guys are all crammed together like sardines, as you saw in that Howard Pyle painting. They found that out to their cost in the last war against the French in North America, in which they were always unsuccessful at the commencement until they had taught their men to maneuver with open ranks and cover themselves by means of trees, after which they were always successful. And so these aren't specialist light infantry that are doing this sort of thing. This is a very standard practice across the British Army at this time. And so as a result, it might not seem as crazy now for a whole bunch of red-coated British soldiers to be traveling from Detroit down to northern Kentucky in order to fight. The British Army as a whole is a fairly capable force when it comes to wilderness warfare. Let's talk a little bit about where the 8th Regiment is deployed in the War of Independence. After 1774, as hostilities appear to be sort of breaking out, the regiment is moved to the upper country posts where they're deployed, moving from your perspective from right to left. At Oswegatchie, at Fort Oswegatchie, you have the Light Company. So this is actually the light infantrymen who are part of the regiment. One company of them are deployed there. Fort Niagara, the largest of these garrisons, you have 4 companies deployed in essentially very close to Niagara Falls. Detroit, 3 companies, and up at Michilimackinac, you have 1 battalion company, and then also the Grenadiers. And so historians who work on the 8th Regiment, like Bill Potter, have noticed to some degree this deployment matches the way that the regiment would be formed on parade, with both the flank companies on either end of the line. And so you do have perhaps some of that parade ground thinking still present, even if the British Army is very adaptable in many ways. Throughout the war, the King's Regiment is not primarily operating as the combat force in the upper country. Their goal is to try and preserve the posts that they are defending. And so places like Niagara, they're trying to defend Fort Niagara during Sullivan's campaign. They're very concerned. I mean, the Americans get maybe 100 miles from Niagara. It's as close as they come to one of these major posts. They do this, by and large, by supporting Lieutenant Airhead and his fellows here, the Indian Department. In many ways, the 8th Regiment of Foot is more impactful as almost like advisors and diplomats working alongside the Indian Department than they are actually during combat operations. Moving to combat operations, third, their goal is to support, not necessarily lead, but to reinforce combat operations that are primarily conducted by Native peoples, secondarily by Loyalists, and maybe thirdly by the regular British Army. We've got to keep in mind, as we've been reminded already twice today, it's Native peoples who hold the power in the upper country. And so in every one of these sort of engagements that I'm going to work through here in a moment, there are many more Native Americans than there are regular British soldiers. Usually there are many more Native Americans than there are sort of green-coated Loyalists fighting alongside the British. So they're certainly there for combat operations, but they're acting in a support role. They are trying to maintain control of the upper company broadly. There are some soldiers deployed up to essentially like the northern shore of Lake Superior to help with the fur trade during the war. And after 1779, sort of as Steve was reminding us just a few minutes ago, the war starts to change. The war becomes more intense out in the West. And I would argue after 1779, you have the 8th Regiment is involved in a number of operations that are almost designed to remove settlers, patriot settlers. And so they, to some extent, like the Americans during Sullivan's campaign, often are targeting food supplies, trying to sort of destroy mills along rivers to encourage patriot settlers to flee the region, sort of clearing this kind of threatening presence from the British perspective. So again, five goals, perhaps, of the 8th Regiment or the King's Regiment in their operations in North America. Usually, these operations take the form of mixed war parties. Almost always, Native Americans, as I just said, make up the largest component. Usually there are a few companies, perhaps as many as 200, but sometimes fewer loyalists who make up these mixed war parties. And then the 8th Regiment is there representing the British Crown, representing the regular forces of the British Army, but they're usually the smallest component. There are some operations, like the Mohawk Valley raids in 1780, where 150 of these men from the 8th Regiment will all be deployed together out on a combat operation. I would say that's the kind of the large end of the spectrum. When they come down to St. Louis in 1780, you have 2 enlisted men from the 8th Regiment, are the only part of the regular British Army there for that operation. So again, there's a wide range of numbers. The quote on the slide here comes from a figure that Steve mentioned, Arndt Schuyler de Peyster, and he much like Ensign Hughes, has kind of dominated the narrative of maybe how ineffective the 8th Regiment of Foot supposedly was during the War of Independence. I mean, he's very, very clear. You must be sensible. My soldiers, talking about the King's Regiment, the 8th Regiment, are little acquainted with wood fighting and ill-equipped for it withal. I have therefore only ordered to take post where they can secure ammunition and provisions. So this is a seemingly strong statement of the lack of skill that the soldiers in the 8th Regiment have, the lack of maybe ability they have in woods fighting. Again, I was talking with Craig before one of the panels, and it is worth saying de Peyster is a little bit of a whiner. In some ways, he's almost like the McClellan of the British Army in the upper country. I mean, he's always saying, I want more material, I want more men, I don't want to send my men out on combat operations until we have superior numbers. And so, maybe this is a true statement. It's also coming from a source that has a tendency to, maybe speaking too honestly, whine a bit. So I think we need to treat it with some care. More helpfully, you have a number of sources from both Henry Hamilton's journal of his operations in 1778, and also from other officers who are along on this expedition, particularly an artillery officer, that describe what the 8th Regiment's operations look like in practice in the field. They're not always, fighting against Whig or American forces. What they are doing is engaging in Indian diplomacy. And so as these men, almost a whole company of the 8th Regiment is moving down to Vincennes in 1778, they are engaged in Indian diplomacy. And that doesn't look like the Indian diplomacy that we've heard about so far, which is primarily grounded in gift-giving. This involves a show of force, showing that the British are an effective military organization. And so as Lieutenant Governor Hamilton is meeting with various native groups on his way down to Vincennes, he's showing what the British Army can do. He's showing that the British Army is a militarily effective force that these Native Americans maybe should put their faith in. And so this takes the form of exercises, of shooting at marks. Hopefully you're all aware, again, there's this idea out there that British soldiers didn't aim. They just kind of, like point at the general direction of the enemy and look away and fire, and this is completely false. The British Army, throughout the War of Independence, is engaged in target practice. I mean, there are orders from Governor Carleton in Canada in a variety of ways, and you can see the evidence here. On November 12th, Lieutenant Governor Hamilton reports, we exercised the cannon and small arms at marks. the arms in very good order, so the soldiers are taking good sort of care of their weapons. The Native Americans expressed great surprise to see a mark a foot square struck by the 6-pounder. So this is a very accurate use of artillery at about 300 yards distance. In a later meeting on the 19th, he gets into a dispute with Native leaders, and his response to this is to, again, maybe show the British Army is a winning institution. We should back this British Army, and he does this by breaking off his discussions and going out and calling out the regular British soldiers that are there on the expedition. And he says, I told them I was going to exercise my young men, and gave orders to the men to turn out and fire a ball at a mark, which they did, showed great dexterity, firing very quick and making excellent shots. This is, again, as I said, the same instance on the 19th is recorded in the diary of an artillery officer who's present on the expedition. The troops was ordered to fire 3 rounds. Each man had targets in the presence of the Indians, and the Indians was very well pleased at their performance. So again, these are soldiers who are effective, who are able to turn out and not just make a good show on the parade ground, but engage in dexterous and accurate use of their firearms in order to, again, engage in that Indian diplomacy. Okay, I want to talk a little bit, and there's a lot of text on this slide, and there are even battles like Blue Licks that I didn't cram on here because I ran out of room, but I want you to sort of see the way that the British engage in what we might think of as a policy of almost like active defense of these forts in the upper country. What we have here is expeditions sent out, certainly the ones we're familiar with at Vincennes, the 2 soldiers who go down to St. Louis. You have Henry Byrd's raids into Kentucky. These are all, of course, very important moments in the war, but also, I mean, I'm not sure if you can really say that what's happening in New York State is the West, but it's, I mean, certainly the West of, from the perspective of maybe Henry Clinton in New York City. And so here, the British are trying to fight the Whig militias, Whig-aligned Native Americans, far enough away from their forts in order to preserve these forts on Canada, trying to achieve those other 4 goals that I discussed. And so I just want to touch on a couple of these sort of marks on the map. Probably the best day the regiment has, if we can use kind of that way of thinking, is the fight at the Cedars in May of 1776. Here, again, there are a small number of British soldiers. Only about 40 men of the regiment are present at the Battle of the Cedars. And there are a much larger, perhaps 300 to 500 Native Americans that they are supporting. This is a great victory from the British perspective. They capture a number of American soldiers. They push back the American invasion of Canada. This sort of operation, I think, is in many ways how the British think about success in the upper country. They're trying to replicate what happened at the Cedars in the other engagements of this war. And so you have many other, and I'm not going to go down through the entire list, but at the fight at St. Louis that we just heard about from Steve, here there are only 2 soldiers from the 8th Regiment that are present. And they're sort of their letters asking sort of for volunteers or which soldiers are going to be chosen. They're both soldiers that speak Gaelic. And so Bill Potter, who wrote his master's thesis on this unit in the 1980s, argues, and I think there is some evidence to suggest maybe this is what's going on, is these men are almost engaged in what the Navajo code talkers were doing during the Second World War. They're communicating in a language that they, at least the British administration, thinks perhaps will not be terribly common in the upper country. There are other, I mean, the success or failure from the American perspective at Martin and Ruddle stations has been discussed a couple of times. This is during Byrd's invasion of Kentucky. You have other successes such as, again, the brutality of the war that Dr. Nelson mentioned this morning. The way that when the British, after 1779, after they see what happens to the Iroquois Confederacy during Sullivan's campaign, they go out then and start doing the same thing, destroying foodstuffs, destroying mills. And so this is what's going on in the first and second Mohawk Valley expeditions. The British are trying to destroy American food production abilities in order to try and control the upper country. There are also sort of defensive operations during the Sullivan Campaign. 12 soldiers are sent out to support the native forces under Joseph Brant and others who are trying to stop the American invasion of Iroquois in central New York. The fight in Newtown is not really a success. Not only the 12 soldiers who went out, but indeed many Native Americans end up returning to Niagara. There's something of a refugee crisis at Niagara in the winter of 79 into 80. This is, again, part of the job of the 8th Regiment, not just to engage in combat operations, but also to engage in support for Native Americans, engage in Native diplomacy. All right. There's a wonderful photograph from a great young photographer up at Fort Niagara named Lee Gugino. And this is a depiction of what the 8th Regiment would have looked like on that Mohawk Valley raid in 1780. The war ends. The 8th Regiment, after 17 years, is finally replaced by new troops coming in to man these posts, which again, even though by treaty they're supposed to give over to the young United States, but they decide to hold on to until the middle of the 1790s. And I do think that this inspection return in 1786 maybe tells a different story. First of all, the regiment is really shrunk. There are only 227 men left. This isn't to say they all became casualties. Many of them likely stayed in North America. Many of them were drafted out of the regiment into other British regiments before the unit returned to Britain. But in 1786, you see a situation where there's both an old regiment and a young regiment. And so there are a lot of men who are sort of 18, 19, in their early 20s. And then there are a number of men who have been with the regiment all throughout its deployment. And so they're in their mid-40s or even their late 40s. The average height has declined, and again, this isn't necessarily because people in the 18th century were really short, but instead because as a whole in Europe at this time, height is on the decline in the 18th century. And this is, you measure this in places from Sweden to Britain to northern Germany. Nutrition is maybe not as good as it is in North America. What is interesting, though, is the average period of service has remained the same to some extent, again, because you have these two regiments. You have maybe almost half the regiment that is new recruits. They've been in the Army 1 year or less. And then you have the other half of the regiment that has served for over 20 years. These are the veterans of the fight in North America that have come back home to England. And I enjoy the breakdown of the nationalities just because we have the 10 foreigners. They're not listed as Germans, but this is what's left of those 72 German recruits that were brought into the unit in 1776. So all of this to say, in some ways, you see the story of the unit, the social composition of the unit changes throughout the course of its 17-year deployment. I would say, despite some significant failures, there are a number of noteworthy successes. I'm going to actually kind of do what I shouldn't do, and I'm going to rewind back to one of the earlier maps. If you look at the posts of the King's Regiment here, they match up pretty well to where the borders of Canada are today. And so I would say, certainly in the early Republic, during the War of Independence, all the way through the War of 1812, an American goal is to annex Canada. It's one of the first things we do in 1775 as we go up and invade Quebec. And so maybe to some extent, because of the King's Regiment, because of the Indian diplomacy they're engaged in, the posts of the King's Regiment match up very well to where the borders of Canada were and where they continue to be. I would also say that Certainly, this regiment was a practical military force. They performed very well at the fight at Stone Arabia, as they're sort of on their way back to Garrison from launching one of the Mohawk Valley raids. But maybe even more important than this practical, flexible, adaptable military force, they are vital as a symbol. They're reminding Loyalists, Native Americans, that the British military, the British government is still present in the upper country. Even increasingly as the war goes on, it doesn't appear as though the war is really going Britain's way. And then last but not least, I think the story of this 17-year deployment shows us the way of how units could change over time, how the social composition of these units differs from the beginning of one of these deployments to the end. Now, obviously, this is a drastic example. Most units were not deployed for 17 years. So I think it's an outlier, and maybe we talk about that a little bit in the question and answer session. But these are regiments that change in character. You have older men who are discharged out of the service by the time the war ends. Many of them end up, I believe, staying in North America. But for the middle-aged men or the younger men who went over in 1768, they do return after 17, almost 20 years of service with the regiment to Britain in 1786. Thank you so much for your time.
We have time for questions. Oh, back there. Okay.
Let me see if I'm loud enough to get on my own.
Excellent.
For the microphone for recording.
Very excellent presentation. As a longtime student of the British Army, I'd be fascinated to see a discussion of the turnover among the officers, both at the company and the battalion level, in, out, purchases, departures, casualties.
Yeah, absolutely. So there are, much like the enlisted men, there is a great deal of change. You have, and Craig can maybe tell us the exact number, but there are multiple officers at the captain level who die on the Great Lakes when ships sink. There are a number of hazards beyond just the war going on. Surprisingly, I think it's both Isaac Brock and his brother from the War of 1812 serve in the regiment at the end of its deployment. So maybe they learn a little bit about the defense of Canada here in this war and then go on to apply that in a later conflict. But what you do see is, in many ways, probably the most aggressive and effective officer in combat operations is Henry Byrd. I mean, he's a lieutenant in 1768. He serves throughout the war, ends up getting his promotion to captain. His papers in the Library and Archives of Canada are very interesting. They deal a lot with the day-to-day life of the unit. Tragically, the sections that deal with active combat operations were missing when I was there in 2019. But they're hoping that they will recover them, and maybe they've just been misfiled. So maybe that's a part of the story that we will know more about in the next 5 or 10 years. I will say right now there's no great one-stop shop story book of this regiment. It's a regiment that a lot of Americans are very interested today because we don't have a lot of British Army history in the Midwest during the Revolution. And so it gets a number of, usually gets some level of attention. And so I'm very hopeful that probably not me, but maybe someone like Craig will write a monograph telling us the story of this regiment, maybe in time for the 250th anniversary of some of its actions.
Anybody else? Nope. Steve has a question.
So I've followed a fair amount of Spanish uniform replacements, so I'm kind of curious if you know anything in terms of the regiment, how often they got new uniform coats and that sort of thing.
Sure. So this is a question that is hotly debated among reenactors because there are many reenactment groups that cover this regiment. Bill Potter, who wrote what essentially is the best single source that we have on the unit now in the 80s, showed the way that they missed their uniform distribution for 3 years running. It was actually captured at Saratoga. And so it's possible that they were not quite wearing regulation clothing for some of the war. If you look at the Ensign Sumaraz's papers in the Library of Archives of Canada, I believe it's very likely that they adapt their clothing to the upper country. They're wearing blue woolen tall gaiters or leggings for some of the war. Although again, I would say that's not something we have definitive proof of. That's more of supposition based on purchase orders. Yeah, this is. It's likely that, especially during Hamilton's expedition, they are wearing the sort of gaitered trousers that we associate with the British Army during this war, and that comes from that same artillery officer that I mentioned. His diary, he recalls sort of having some of those, so I think it's likely that most of the British soldiers did on that expedition. But again, this is something that reenacting is kind of like, you got to be careful. It's almost like church splits happening, right? I mean, different reenactors come to different conclusions, and there was 2 groups of reenactors who basically broke up over the question, do we call it the 8th Regiment or King's, or the King's 8th Regiment? And if you look at the documents that I've displayed here today, the officers of the regiment call it both things. So I don't think this is, there's not like necessarily a right answer to a lot of these questions. But certainly in the story of the war, garments like the gaitered trouser are an important part of the British Army overall. I think one of the most interesting debates about the uniformology of the regiment is, do they adopt Burgoyne campaign modifications in 1777? Are they part of that Canadian Army? I should say, that's not something that I'm really comfortable coming out on one way or another. I think there is sort of supposition on both sides. And again, this is something that I'm a reenactor. I'm in the same unit as these guys that I've showed pictures of. But this is something that deeply divides the reenacting community, and there are a lot of different groups that do the 8th. So.
Okay, another question here.
I was wondering how they recruited such a large number of early 20s German-speaking soldiers to become soldiers. Where did they get them? Did they go to Germany? Were they in England already? And how did they
A question that, sure, absolutely. A number of historians have written
this
good stuff on. Don Haggis, maybe you're familiar with some of his work. Some of his early articles address this question. But in 1776, there are recruiting efforts by the British Army directly in Germany. And so this is not just something unique that happens to the 8th. There are German-speaking soldiers in a large number of British marching regiments in the American War of Independence. And so the questions of communication, often British and Hessian officers will communicate using French, because they're elite men of the 18th century. They usually have some understanding of French. Prince Henry of Prussia says it's important for all young officers to be French, to speak French, lest they be thought of as some sort of Germanic beast. And so I don't know that's quite true in England or North America in the same way, but you do have French as a language of communication among the officer class. Among the enlisted men, that's a bit thornier question, and certainly I don't believe that a lot of these young enlisted men coming out of Germany probably speak French, and so the short answer is I don't know the answer to that question. I do think that there is a little bit more bilingual ability even among common people. If you read the letters and diaries of sort of soldiers from the 18th century, more of them are literate than what we think. And there are many examples of soldiers serving in armies that essentially don't speak their language. So this is maybe a challenge, but is one that many armies are able to overcome.
Okay, yes.
2 questions. During the 17 years you're talking about, where did the colonels and the lieutenant colonels reside? Were they even in North America? And the other question is, what was the history of the regiment going on into the 19th and 20th century?
that's a good question. So answering the first question first, you definitely do have senior officers, like the colonel proprietor is a man named General Bagot Armstrong, and he does not come to North America. He stays in Europe. As a result, the regiment is led by essentially the lieutenant colonel as the senior officer in the field with them. And usually that lieutenant colonel is either at Detroit or at Niagara. As far as, there is absolutely a transition, and sometimes that's connected to those shipwrecks that I mentioned. I honestly cannot recall if anyone resigns due to old age. I know that there are some officers who really don't like spending a lot of time with the regiment, but they do not resign. And then as far as their history goes on into the 19th century, I'm a little bit fuzzy on that, but as I recall, the 8th Foot is, at least one battalion of the 8th Foot is there in North America during the War of 1812. I also believe that they may have served at least one battalion in the expedition to Egypt in the late 1790s during the War of the Second Coalition against Napoleon. But they're absolutely sort of very active, both in the fight in Europe against Napoleon. At least one battalion, I believe, serves in the West Indies, and then also in North America during the War of 1812. So after the regiment is rebuilt in the late 1780s and early 1790s, they're again fit for service to be sent out in the Napoleonic Wars.
Great. Oh.
You've given us a snapshot of just one of the regiments the British had over here. For a lot of these soldiers that would go back home in a society that's rather restricted, almost a caste-type society, after the war, this place must still look pretty attractive to them, especially after being here 17 years. Has anybody ever done any studies on how many British soldiers actually stayed back in the United States?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So that number has been answered decisively with regard to the Hessians, or the Subsidiensgruppen, broadly, that Dr. Baer was talking about before. It's not as many as we might think. Sometimes you hear like a third of Hessians stayed or something like that. That's probably not true. In the figures that I recall come from Daniel Krebs' book, A Generous and Merciful Enemy. He talks maybe about, in some states, 12% of these soldiers might stay. As far as how many stayed in North America after the war in the British Army, that's not something that I've read much on. So unfortunately, I can't answer that definitively. But I was actually talking with Craig before one of the panels about, do we know this with regards to the 8th? And certainly there are sort of bustling civilian communities around many of these forts at places like Michilimackinac, Detroit, at Niagara. And so my guess would be a lot of those men, because we say in 1776 or early 77, the regiment is like 600 men strong, but only 227 end up going back to England when the war is done, or that's the snapshot that we have from the 1786 return. And of those, 90-some are new recruits. And so I think it's likely that some of them did stay. Some of them stayed, some of them were discharged, some of them were drafted into other units. But as far as the exact percentage, unfortunately, I couldn't say.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Burns.
Thanks so much.